Yeah, we are really happy to have Magda Tyzlik Carver as our next guest. She is, in contrast to Nora, here for the first time, which is even more exciting for us, because Magda Tyzlik Carver is showing what curatorial research can mean in terms of a professional career. She is wearing different hats, working as assistant professor of digital design at Aarhus University in Denmark, and as independent curator likewise. Her research is focused on intersections of computation and practices of participation in contemporary art and culture. So like this, she's bringing together art history, software studies, effect theory, curatorial practice, and new materialism. As a consequence, she has both published and curated widely. She is co-editor of Executing Practices, which is gathering different perspectives of artists, programmers, and theorists to engage in critical intervention into the concept of execution in software. And her most recent curatorial project is Screenshots, Desire and Automated Image, which was shown in Aarhus Gallery Image in March and April 2019. So here she will broaden the field into the field of digital, and we are really happy to have her here. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I'm also very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Beatrice von Bismarck, you, Agnieszka, and Julia for inviting me. And actually, when I started my research into curating quite a few years ago, Beatrice's work was definitely on the top of my list, so I'm very honored to be here. So what I'd like to talk about today, and I think that's why I've been invited here, is to talk about the research and a particular focus that my research has had for some time in regards to curating and curatorial practice, and namely the fact that I have queried curating as part of contemporary computational technologies. And so my thinking about curating as a practice and as a critical inquiry has always been part of investigation of these technologies. So one of the questions that I started this research was the question of how digital and network technologies influence practice of curating, which at the time for me actually meant quite straightforward practice of showing artworks and contextualizing them within and through exhibition. So what I will present today about curating in one sense might be seen quite far from it, although after the first few talks I think it's actually not going to be far from it, just a different way of doing it. And probably again we'll finish with more questions that we can take to the workshop. So seeing many different practices of artists whose critical and aesthetic use of those technologies was offering new ways of working and thinking about art and its forms also spurred the question of how technologies influence the way art is exhibited and not just produced. So this was very much a curatorial question, but the focus of which was rather different than if we were to ask how to curate new media art in the gallery, but rather, what is the potential of curating in the context of computational culture, and how we can rethink computation and computational technologies through curating. So it is in this context that I want to present my paper today, and also to talk about it, take it, sort of dissect it a little bit in the discussion later. And so my presentation is a proposition that is also representational of certain inquiry into complexity of relations between technology, curating, self, and care. And because today's event is specifically dedicated to research, and I know this is the ethos of the program itself, so I want to take this, perhaps think with the questions and think with certain ideas and think about curating, and it might take us to some unexpected places, but nevertheless, let's try it. So these are the questions that I've already mentioned earlier, but what I want to propose, maybe not as a response to those questions, but as a way to think with, is I want to propose, and I have been proposing that for some time now, is to think of curating as technology, and specifically technology of the self. So I realized that this proposition might be unusual because for decades now, as curators, we have been practicing our trade in museums, collecting, recording, cataloging, and displaying objects as they circulate between archives and displays and publics. And we have engaged in conceptualizing and inventing forms of display that can accommodate new objects and materials used for making artworks. And as curators take care of objects, they also are invested in production of knowledge about these objects, creating meaning through material contextualizations of objects in an exhibition space or in a collection or an archive. And by generating new relations between objects, proposing conceptual frameworks that assert or critically intervene into already existing arrangements of culture. These are then announced or presented and published as subjects of curatorial care and commitment. So what we can see is development of a particular relation between care and knowledge that seems to be quite crucial in and for curating. At the same time, the question of what curators do and what curating is broadly discussed and often contested. The fact that in the 60s, curating didn't exist as a verb, only as a noun, as critic and curator Guy Brett claims, points to the fact that curating involves a diverse set of activities that continuously shift and expand. Others even assure us that it is unlikely to return to the situation in which the curator is perceived as a facilitator and caretaker, someone who used to search the storage rooms of their collections, which also has been a kind of a long-standing and go-to definition of curators. So in this talk, I want to think through this idea of curating as caretaking, and I want to think through this notion of care that curators perform, and how technology is part of it, and how knowledge is a result of it. And I'm sure you also have been aware of this kind of recurring turn or return, especially recently, to sort of putting care at the center of curatorial practice. It seems that everyone cares these days. But I would recommend, there's this wonderful essay by Eugene Thacker and Alex Galloway entitled On Misanthropy, and it kind of queries this idea of care and suggests that perhaps maybe we also have to be a little bit careless. So my reference to care is linked to feminist genealogies and practices and labor of maintenance and forms of reproduction of the social as a material and situated practice of care and sustenance. It also is about affective dimension of work as wages for housework or ecofeminists engaged with. But at the same time, of course, I am thinking about the notion of care of the self that Foucault writes about. Specifically, the relation of the subject to the forms of governance, tracing relation of knowledge and power, those technologies and tools through which human beings constitute themselves. And I will expand on that specifically today in relation to curating as technology of the self. So not just curators of art, independent curators and those employed by museums, but today we are dealing with multiplicities of curating. From curating content on platforms such as Wikipedia and Facebook to curating data in libraries and science institutions, and also, of course, commercial companies. From categorizing objects and their classification to tagging, keywords, and taxonomies. Not just exhibitions and collections, but user profiles and databases are now new formats of curating and new places of care. So when I propose to think of curating as a form of technology, I consider these spaces new forms of curating. I refer to this as post-human curating, a practice that is distributed and performed by many different agents, not just curators, but users of social media, not just people, but algorithms and platforms. Today, curating is post-human as the curatorial function of collecting, archiving, organizing, and display expands beyond the usual field of art and its institutions and usual subjects. Today, not just art is curated, but content and data are the objects of contemporary forms of curation by algorithms as part of big data and machine learning models. To consider curating post-human is to ask how curating as a process of knowledge production is challenged by contemporary computational technologies such as AI and big data. To consider curating post-human is to also ask what practices of curating develop as curating becomes increasingly distributed among human and non-human actors and across computational infrastructures and its institutions. So when I say post-human curating is a form of technology, I refer to the way that Foucault talks about technologies as truth games, related to specific techniques that human beings use to understand themselves. And he mentions 4 technologies, which are technology of production, technology of science system, technology of power, and technology of the self. These are not completely separate and are part of each other to a different degree, but for Foucault, technology of the self is closely associated with care of the self as care for the body and for the soul. He famously starts his lectures on the hermeneutics of the subject with an example of, and I'm going to speak in Greek, I think, but so it's not going to sound as it should, but if anyone knows how to say it, please tell me. So it is epimelestai sato, the practice of care of the self. He argues a practice of the care of the self which he traces to ancient Greece in texts of Plato and others. So technologies of the self, according to Foucault, and I quote, permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies, souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality, end of quote. Foucault traces how care of the self is an ongoing process of transformation, and he poses this in relation to the question of knowing the self, to practices of self-knowledge, or more specifically, frames it within the question about the relation between the subject and truth. So epimelestai sato, the practice of care of the self, he argues, has been neglected in Western thought and philosophy, which today privileges the principle of know yourself, where in fact it was the care of the self which was the original principle in which to know oneself. You can know yourself by taking care of the self. And Foucault defines care of the self as, and I quote, dense set of notion, practices, ways of being, forms of existence, and so on, end of quote. And he's challenging the assumption that the knowledge of ourselves alone will give us access to truth. He reaches back to antiquity to demonstrate to us that at another time, one had to do things to oneself, one had to care, one had to attend to oneself, to one's soul, and it is this caring that gives access to knowledge. So these practices are performed by the bodies, on the bodies, and bodies are central to them as practices where self transforms itself, where discursive practices of the self is also a material practice of the transformation of the body through such practices as, for example, techniques of meditation, of memorization of the past, of examination of conscience, of checking representations which appear in the mind, and so on. These different forms that the exercise of the self takes, such as meditation, but also listening, reading, writing, and truth-telling, and textual and verbal practices were also being picked up more widely, not just as a way to record and represent poetry or dialogue, but also something more prosaic in nature. Writing was becoming a form of care. And Foucault goes deep into the question of the subject and interrogates the relation of the care of the self being replaced by another practice of knowing oneself. And so the question is, what is the relation between practice of self-care and knowledge practices? Post-human curating locates contemporary transformations of the self and links them to everyday experiences across and with computational technologies, their infrastructures and users. This is a contemporary practice that is part of post-human ecologies and computation, which increasingly become common practices that participate in the complex infrastructural arrangements of objects, data, bodies that are not only digital. How bodies, human and non-human, are operative in such systems. In other words, how they are exploited for computation. So this is post-human curating is partly an inquiry into practices that weaponize computation while selling to wider public the vision of digital progress through this idea of knowledge and care. So I want to propose there is a tension in contemporary curating, and post-human curating accounts for this tension, which rises from the fact that different bodies, human and non-human, computational, neoliberal infrastructures, human experiences and affective forces are all at work. So to illustrate this process of changing conditions for curating, but also this tension, which could be considered in relation between care and knowledge, I want to talk about it with an example of a net art project, live sharing, by artist duo Eva and Franco Mattes, also known at the time as 0100101101010101.org. So live sharing was a public artwork which unraveled on the internet between 2000 and 2003. The artwork was originally commissioned by the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. During this time, the artist opened their computer and made it accessible to anyone's scrutiny. Emails, files, bank statements, everything was made available for access and any kind of manipulation. This was an act of radical gesture of self-surveillance, as artists talked about it at the time. The title, Live Sharing, was an ironic anagram of file sharing, which at the time of a failed dot-com boom was almost the internet ideology, also present in a motto, information wants to be free, and in business models such as Napster and similar. Rhizome, an online net organization and archive, defines live sharing as prototypical mediation on life online, as it already at the time demonstrated how digital and network technologies are enmeshed in everyday, even before mainstream and social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and so on existed. So a visit to the artist's URL address via internet browser would take the user directly to the parent directory on artist's personal computer. After keying 01001011010101.org, the visitor would be given completely unrestricted access to all files, images, emails, and any other kind of data stored on the computer's drive. They would be allowed to open and view files, but also change them, delete, or even add new files. As a radical act of making private files, lives accessible publicly, the project illustrates how communication between people and relation between them change as they become part of a network process. Live sharing intimately demonstrates that the relation between public and private is radically altered when the act of accessing publicly available files is simultaneously an act of entering a private space. I am using this example because even though live sharing is a net art project, it anticipates practices from, well, almost 20 years ago. It anticipates practices that today are normalized and automated. And I argue that the project is a case with which to reflect on contemporary forms and conditions of curating and its objects. Here, curating, which as we know have proliferated with online technologies, is about data and about self. More precisely, about the artists themselves. It is about forms of self-disclosure, self-tracking, and practices in which the self becomes available to computation and part of the network. If we go back to Foucault terminology, it is about how the self transforms itself through self-curation, self-disclosure, and practices of quantified self. Opening of one's computer at the time, in year 2000, was a radical act of sharing and simultaneously an experiment in living the doctrine that information wants to be free. The artists turned their computer into a publicly accessible server, and they were ready to test the consequences. One of them was the fact that the project had to be taken down after 3 years due to the impossibility to maintain it on the part of museum and on the part of the artists. Living in public was both exhausting and dangerous. Matthew Fuller refers to the project as data nudism to describe this radical gesture of transparency and open access. And I want to pick up on this description of the work as data nudism, and with it discuss 3 things which I think are worth considering, especially when reflecting on the internet and infrastructures for post-human curating. Firstly, the fact that nudism usually assumes the agency is with the nudist. So the person chooses to expose themselves, and in this case, it was the artist's decision to share lives and files. This status of the work as data sharing is simultaneously a form of data exposure. Eva and Franco Matte's data collection consists of everything that ends up in their computer, from bank statements and photos to net artworks by others, copied and saved on the couple's computer, to emails, some of which were read by visitors before the artist had a chance to read them. In fact, sometimes the visitors would answer the emails or add a postscriptum in the message. Today, such a way of revealing personal information is unthinkable, and in fact, everyone would advise against it, yet it takes place regularly. Conditions of data sharing have changed. Rather than the act of consent, it is regularly a case of data grabbing and data capturing with little ability to curate it, and often with limited consent, which brings me to the second point. Data nudism suggests that there is something natural about data, that there might be a state of data that can be considered nude, free, out there, ready to be extracted. Yet this is more often a process of naturalizing data. If we interpret data nudism as referring to certain purity, it can be easily assumed that such data is not just pure or unedited, almost capturing the real thing, as it were. Yet, if we agree with Jeffrey Bowker and Lisa Gittelman and Virginia Jackson, such nude data, or as they prefer to call it, raw data, is an oxymoron. It simply does not exist. As these scholars remind us, data does not simply appear in the digital world, but rather is collected, archived, cleaned, trained, and manipulated in lots of different ways. And these are also forms of curating. This is a moment, and this is also a moment for a possible intervention through curating. Hito Steyo's description of the work as both radical transparency and abstract pornography points to ambiguity of the internet and to the potential for many forms of exploitation and to the conditions in which that exploitation already takes place. The third thing I want to also bring here is that data nudism suggests a way to think about the relation between data and body, how bodies make data and how bodies become data. To the artist, this project was about data rather than a body, and indeed, when we look at the archived version of the project on Rhizome, life sharing is a collection of hundreds of thousands of files that can be accessed and explored today, and as the record of how the artist tested out this mantra of information wanting to be free. But if we think of this work as a performance that continued for almost 3 years, then it is quite helpful to consider data-body relations. Contemporary living in the networked and datafied world has led to the production of unprecedented amounts of data, Internet of Things, and many other augmented computing, known as quantified self, where self is captured by Fitbits and similar devices, happens almost with every breath. The artists comment on how in the 90s, and I quote, "it was all about merging with the network." End of quote. Today, in a sense, we are already data, or in the process of becoming data, as we merge with networks continuously through practices of self-tracking or simply being active online. The artists describe how the server on which the files were stored was in their bedroom and how they slept with the blinking LED lights and noises coming from the computer. This was how the network would manifest itself in the private flat of the artist, a body of the computer which is always on, always connected, and always open. Users, when entering the files on the live-sharing server, were welcomed with the message, "Now you are in my computer," the only mark that they now cross into a space that belongs to someone else. And so even though the focus of the project was on data and not bodies, it is clear that bodies, human and non-human, were part of its making, and that the work was performed with them. Reflecting on these 3 points, in live sharing, agency in data practices, raw data and forms of data extraction, and data as body, reveals how the context for such a form of online living has completely changed, and also possible points of intervention through curating. Participation in network culture is about choice, to a certain degree, but increasingly a necessity and a form of enclosure that comes with digital living and being online. Once connected, the issue is not about how to disconnect, which is considered increasingly a sign of privilege. Being connected is about being monitored or self-monitoring, self-tracking. It is about profiling, identification, optimization, and also simultaneously self-surveillance. Today, bodies are always networked, always connected, and always producing data, leaving little, if any, possibility for living off-grid. In order to conclude, but yet obviously keeping things open. No, not thank you. Well, thank you. I propose that post-human curating defines a tendency, a certain development of curating in computational culture, which expose ambiguities of contemporary technologies of computation, while also recognizing that computational technologies are biotechnologies that effectively operate also on our bodies, as well as computers, cities, homes, environments, and so on. And maybe post-human curating as a project of critique and also as a critical practice of curating might be a helpful tool to develop strategies of resistance to such forms of governance. And I guess I'm going to be questioned on that. The question of how does one curate the self is the question about care and control over life. It is a question of biopolitics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Magda. Are there any questions? Of course, we also have the chance later in the workshops to really discuss with our guests, but you might have immediate questions, urgent questions, short questions. Nothing? Okay, maybe I have a question, because I pretty much like that you ended with this potential of criticality in self-curation, and I think it pretty much linked to Nora's approach to self-education. And so I'm really interested in how post-human curating could exactly be a tool to a more self-educated, emancipatory way of becoming public.
Yes, thank you for the question, and it was really great to have your presentation before. I don't know how to answer that question. You know, how could it? Actually, it's a question for everyone. How could it be? I think what is interesting about it is that it already is a practice that we all perform, and that we already have some kind of response to it. So sometimes we are quite happy with doing another like and on the Facebook, or adding another image and distributing ourselves in those ways. But sometimes we are quite aware of the fact that perhaps those practices are rather intrusive, right? And I think it's the question that quite a lot of people have been involved for some time. So how to, or the question of the surveillance and data surveillance is the one that is really at the kind of core of what I am kind of addressing here as well. So there are kind of data activists and various people who kind of engage with the ways in which, how do we deal with the reality of the contemporary digital living? But it is a difficult one, and I think it will become even more difficult because with the contemporary machine learning processes and similar, kind of to understand how we actually distribute ourselves, how we generate how we become data, but also what kind of subjects are constructed out of this data that we produce is only something that we start to think about in the kind of more sort of popular domain. And I think that relation, this kind of, the realization that it's not just me, but there is also my data, and the relation between me and my data is one that is quite difficult to understand, is probably, and how to deal with it is probably what this kind of question of post-human curating is really, to me, about, and quite helpful in thinking through that relation. Would you like to add anything?
In that respect, to respond, it's not only me and my data, but maybe referring to Nora, it would be me and my museum, or me and my Bergen Assembly, or me and my fire station. So in this respect, this way of reappropriating, I don't know if that would fit. Maybe you can just like add something to that. So.
Thank you so much for thinking it and helping me to answer. Yeah, the first thing that comes in my mind is that, yes, I am very happy that you talked after me, because it's exactly what I was saying. I think that if we think about Donna Haraway's critique of representation, of this museum analysis, it is so obvious that critique of representation was actually critique of power and not critique of representation. It was not sports to understand how exhibitions are organized. It was a way to counteract to the powerful knowledge. And this doesn't seem to me as a way to counteract today. We have to relate, I think, exactly as you said. Yeah? We have to care and to relate for what is governing us. Now, I think appropriation and expropriation is important to think about, because, I mean, and this, in Berlin now, expropriation is a term that means that privatized housing can become commons again. What does it mean in terms of privatized data is a question that I just ask myself. At the same time, we met Farid from Ruangruppe 2 days ago in our research seminar. It's fantastic that all the people from the research seminar came here to Leipzig now. And he said, the Documenta Archive asks us to give them our WhatsApp, but we will never do it, even though we know that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. So obviously, it's still more dangerous to let a public institution have your data than a private one, for whatever reasons, you know. So just for myself, to make it more complicated, one thing is, yes, I think it will be very important to think the question of data in relation to the question of property, and the other common property is carry as well.